Understanding poetry in a close reading context is different from understanding poetry in a broader sense, simply because we're operating without contextual understanding. We're operating without contextual understanding. A close reading is exactly that. This applies for poetry, prose, and drama. Context is not a feature of the marking key. There might be one or two points you want to make where you want to make a contextual suggestion or acknowledgement. That's fine if it's largely date-based. You know, if you're told a poet died in World War One and it's quite clearly a war poem, fine, that's okay. If it's something mentioned in the little byline or description of what is provided about the poet or the author or the playwright, again, that's okay. But as I said, context is not a key component at all in a close reading. It is absolutely about interpretation of meaning relative to structure and the other conventions and devices that are used throughout. Now let's be clear. Poetry can be a bit difficult to get a handle on. It is the most abstract in potential in regards to language usage. But every little component of it can be questioned. The poet Allen Ginsberg said that poetry is language that's been empowered. And another writer, Michael Schmidt, suggested that the real location of poetry within the words are in the spaces between the words. And what he meant by that is the role played by things like caesura, enjambment, stanza, etc. Those components create the expectation. If we're reading an enjambed line in a poem, we kind of get that sense that something is coming. And that pause or that expectation, that thought that rhyme is on the way, in many ways that's what makes poetry what it is. So, setting that aside, what I think is the most important thing to do in poetry is just simply imagine hearing it out loud and wondering what it best sounds like. Does it have a mournful quality, an abstract quality, a disembodied quality? Do I hear an individual voice writing it? Do I feel like I'm hearing somebody talk to me? Do I feel like I'm hearing somebody's inner voice? If I can get a sense of voice, then I think I'm then I think I'm very much on my way to finding or establishing the kind of connection between the text and myself, the reader, that allows me to then interpret. And obviously, the wealth of poetic technique available is huge. Again, don't underestimate the power of plain spoken language, everyday language that has been elevated by form or structure. Yes, you should be looking for rhyme. Yes, you should be looking for conventional rhyming structures such as ABAB. Maybe you should be looking for heroic couplets because you know what a heroic couplet is. Maybe you should be able to identify that there are lines, whether it be throughout or just sporadic, that are in trochaic tetrameter. These are devices you should know. Of course, you should be able to identify alliteration and assonance. And not only should you be able to find them, but you should be able to argue why a writer might want an alliterative or an assonant quality at any given time. Analysing poetry, you must be thinking about the breaks in stanza. It's a technique not to use any, to block everything together. Creates a sense of poetic intensity. Don't just look at the words, look at the spaces. They can be an indication of abstraction, they can be an indication of tone, they can be an indication of freeness and freedom, which often the free verse quality produces, or stream of consciousness, for example. A writer might be using a rigid structure like a sonnet or a particular quatrain structure sincerely or ironically. You know, there are certain poets, for example, who use a very rigid structure only to be talking about feeling oppressed or contained. So I think it's very, very important to ask yourself, well, this is what I can see. What is a possible reason that it is there? I do think too often people are far too quick to interpret a poem and to argue that their interpretation is the meaning of the poem. Don't. It is an interpretation. That is how you describe it. You can be very definite about the technique you identify, but you are speculating as to its purpose. So make sure that is a component. That understanding is never something you set aside in producing a close reading. As with all close readings, there needs to be a unifying position. A close analysis is really just you're looking line by line. A close reading is you have reached a kind of understanding that you are trying to develop throughout your essay, with the end result of producing something that coheres into a particular viewpoint on the studied text. You can't just sort of wander your way through it without ever arriving at some kind of summative interpretation of your studied poem. So really the key here is to get a sense of that voice, that persona, to get a sense of its tone, to get a sense of its attitude towards what it is talking about, the value that it is placing on it, or whatever those things are, to really question all elements of the setting out, and to be able to delve deeper into specific poetic devices through being fully aware of what they are.